16 years after ruthlessly discarding his wife, unaware she was carrying his heirs. A tech billionaire receives a call that brings his empire to a halt. Lillian's voice is trembling as she delivers the devastating news. His twin daughters are dying, and he is their only hope. With less than 48 hours to act, Edward leaves a billion-dollar merger on the table, walks out of his boardroom, and races toward the family he never knew he had. My dear family, welcome to Mr. Davies' Stories. I have a humble request on your behalf. Dear Lord, we come before you today with humble hearts, realizing just like Edward did, that we often chase the wrong treasures. We chase gold, we chase pride, and we chase status, all while leaving the people who truly love us behind in the rain. We ask for forgiveness for the moments we chose, anger over understanding and silence over reconciliation. We pray for every broken family reading this right now, for every father estranged from his children, for every mother praying for a miracle, and for every child waiting for a parent to come home. Lord, build a bridge. We lift up those fighting sickness in hospital rooms today. Just as you flowed through Edward's sacrifice to save Vicky and Michelle, let your healing power flow through them. Soften our hard hearts. Remind us that our true wealth isn't in our bank accounts, but in the hands we hold. Give us the courage to say, "I'm sorry," before it's too late. The tragedy began on a night that should have been a celebration. In the sterile, glass-walled luxury of Edward's penthouse, Lillian R. Conroy moved with a warmth that defied the cold architecture. She stood by the window, her dark hair catching the city lights, adjusting Edward's tie with a tenderness that unsettled him. "You don't have to conquer the world tonight, Ed," she had whispered, her dark eyes searching his. That was Lillian. She was the only person who saw the man behind the net worth, the only woman who made his glass tower feel like a home rather than an asset. But that peace shattered the moment the private investigator's dossier hit the mahogany desk. Inside were the photos, grainy, manipulated, and damning. Edward didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't look for the truth in Lillian's stunned expression. He reverted to what he knew best, cold calculation. He saw liability, not a wife. As he ordered her out of the apartment, his face hardened into a mask of indifference, completely missing the way Lillian's hand drifted protectively to her stomach, shielding the secret twins he wouldn't meet until they were dying. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, blurring the city lights into streaks of chaotic gray. But the atmosphere inside the room was far colder than the storm raging over the skyline. Edward B. Lawn sat behind his mahogany desk, a fortress of solitude he had constructed to separate himself from the world, and by extension, from the woman standing before him. He didn't look at her face. Instead, his piercing eyes were fixed on the manila folder resting on the polished marble surface, a dossier that, in his mind, had just converted his marriage from an asset into a severe liability. "I don't make bad investments, Lillian," Edward said, his voice eerily calm, devoid of the passion that had once defined their whirlwind romance. "And I certainly don't tolerate partners who breach the contract." Lillian R. Conroy stood near the fireplace, her silhouette trembling slightly. She wasn't looking at the luxury that surrounded them. She was looking at the man she loved, trying to find a trace of her husband beneath the billionaire's armor. "Is that what I am to you, Ed? A partner? A contract to be reviewed?" "Don't deflect," Edward snapped, finally looking up. His gaze was glacial. He slid the photos across the desk, grainy, manipulated images that his private investigator had promised were authentic proofs of her infidelity. The evidence is right here. Late nights, hotel lobbies. It's all very cliché, Lillian. I expected more creativity from you. Lillian reached for the photos, her hands shaking, but she dropped them as if they burned. These are lies. Someone is trying to hurt us. Edward, look at me. You know who I am. I know that feelings are a variable I can't control, and facts are constants I can trust, he retorted, standing up to button his suit jacket. It was a gesture of dismissal, a signal that the meeting was over. I've already had legal draw up the separation papers. You'll be compensated, of course. I'm not a monster. But you need to leave. Tonight. Lillian's eyes widened, filling with tears that she refused to let fall. She took a step toward him, her hand instinctively drifting to her lower abdomen, a protective reflex he was too blinded by anger to notice. She opened her mouth to tell him everything. To tell him that he wasn't just evicting a wife, but a father. But the look on his face stopped her. It was the look of a stranger. A man who had already calculated his losses and moved on. You're making a mistake, Edward, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the secret she now decided to keep. You think you're cutting your losses, but you're throwing away the only real thing you have. I'm securing my future, he said, turning his back to her to stare out at the rain. Goodbye, Lillian. He heard the soft click of her heels retreating, the heavy thud of the penthouse door closing, and then silence. Edward exhaled, adjusting his cuffs, convinced he had just saved himself from a disaster. He had no idea that as the elevator doors slid shut, he had just impoverished himself in the only currency that mattered, casting his own flesh and blood out into the storm. 16 years later, the silence in the penthouse had only deepened, growing heavy and thick like stagnant water. Edward stood before the same floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at a city he now effectively owned. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged with expensive grace. Silver now threading the temples of his dark hair, his suit tailored to a microscopic precision that screamed power. But his eyes remained two cold, stagnant pools. He had acquired everything he had ever aimed for. Competitors crushed, mergers finalized, a net worth that fluctuated by millions while he slept. Yet, in the quiet moments between board meetings and charity galas, a phantom ache throbbed in his chest, a persistent hollowness that no acquisition could fill. He turned away from the view, the vast, empty living room stretching out before him. It was a museum of success, filled with art he didn't enjoy and furniture he rarely used. He poured a glass of scotch, the crystal clinking sharply in the quiet. He told himself he was content. He told himself that solitude was the price of greatness. But tonight, the lie tasted bitter. He found himself thinking of a rainy night 16 years ago, a memory he usually suppressed with ruthless efficiency. Why did the victory of that night feel so much like a defeat now? His smartphone buzzed on the marble island, the vibration sounding like a jarring alarm in the stillness. It was a private line, a number given to fewer than 10 people on the planet. He frowned, setting his drink down. The screen displayed a number he hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades, yet one his brain had never deleted. Lillian. His heart hammered a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. For a moment, he stared at the screen as if it were a bomb. Why now? Was she coming for money? Revenge? He almost let it go to voicemail, his instinct for self-preservation kicking in. But a strange, magnetic pull forced his hand. He swiped to answer. "This is a surprise," Edward said, his voice rusty, lacking its usual boardroom command. "I assume you're not calling to catch up on old times, Lillian." There was a pause on the other end, filled not with the defiance he expected, but with a terrifying, ragged breath. It was the sound of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. "I didn't want to make this call, Edward." Lillian's voice came through, trembling but laced with a fierce, desperate steel. "I promised myself I never would. But I don't have a choice anymore." "What do you want?" he asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "It's not about what I want," she sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "It's about who is dying. You need to come to St. Jude's. Now. Not as a CEO, Edward. I need you to come as a father." The word hung in the air, foreign and impossible, shattering the glass walls of his carefully constructed reality. "Oh, a father?" he repeated, the scotch forgotten, the city lights blurring behind him. "Lillian, what are you talking about?" "You have daughters, Edward," she whispered, the revelation landing with the force of a physical blow. "Twins. And if you don't get here tonight, they won't survive the week." The black helicopter cut through the night sky like a blade, descending onto the hospital roof with a deafening roar that scattered the few birds braving the storm. Edward didn't wait for the rotors to slow. He ducked under the spinning blades, his Italian leather shoes skidding on the wet concrete, the wind whipping his expensive suit into a frenzy. He moved not with the calculated strut of a CEO, but with the frantic, stumbling gait of a man whose world had just tilted on its axis. He burst through the roof access doors, the sudden silence of the hospital corridor hitting him harder than the noise outside. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax assaulted his senses, a stark contrast to the cedar and leather of his office. Lillian was waiting for him at the end of the hallway, standing outside a secure wing. She looked older, lines of exhaustion etched deep around her mouth, but her eyes were the same fierce, dark flint that had stared him down 16 years ago. She didn't flinch as he approached, breathless and disheveled. "Where are they?" Edward demanded, his voice echoing too loudly in the sterile space. "Is this some kind of sick joke, Lillian? You tell me I'm a father after 16 years? Keep your voice down," she hissed, stepping forward to block his path. She was smaller than him, but in that moment, she seemed immovable. "This isn't a board meeting, Edward. You don't get to demand anything here." "I have a right to know," he snapped, though his anger was rapidly losing ground to a rising tide of panic. "You said twins. You said dying." "I said daughters," she corrected, her voice breaking on the word. She reached into her purse and pulled out a hospital ID bracelet, dangling it before him. It read, "Lawhan Conroy, V and M Dobb, Feb. 14. Edward stared at the date. The math was instantaneous and brutal. February. 7 months after he had thrown her out. She had been 2 months pregnant when he handed her the divorce papers. The realization punched the air out of his lungs. You were pregnant that night." "I tried to tell you," Lillian said, tears finally spilling over. "But you were too busy listing my faults to listen." She pointed toward the glass window of the ICU unit behind her. "Meet Vicky and Michelle. They are 15 years old, Edward. They love painting. They hate math. And right now, their bone marrow is failing them." Edward turned slowly toward the glass. Inside, hooked up to a terrifying array of machines, lay 2 girls. They were pale, their skin almost translucent, but the resemblance was undeniable. They had his chin, his brow, the same dark hair fanning out over the white pillows. They looked like fragile, broken mirrors of himself. The sight of them, so alive yet so close to death, so familiar yet complete strangers, severed the last string of his composure. The mighty Edward B. Lawhan, who had withstood market crashes and corporate takeovers without blinking, felt his legs turn to water. The phantom pain in his chest expanded until it consumed him. He didn't just sit. He collapsed, his knees hitting the cold linoleum with a heavy thud, gasping for air as the weight of 16 lost years crushed him against the hospital floor. "Stand up, Edward." The command was sharp, slicing through his disorientation. Lillian didn't offer a hand. She didn't kneel beside him to offer comfort as the wife he remembered would have done. She stood over him, her arms crossed, watching the billionaire pull himself off the linoleum with the detached scrutiny of a judge viewing a convicted man. Edward braced himself against the wall, his expensive suit rumpled, his breathing ragged. He looked at her, searching for a trace of the woman who used to fold his laundry with love, but he found only a fortress. "Lillian, I need to go in there. I need to explain." "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. She stepped between him and the door, her body forming a physical barrier. "You are not going in there to assuage your guilt. You are not going in there to play the benevolent savior. To them, you are a ghost story, Edward. You are the reason their mother cried herself to sleep for 10 years. "They're my children," he pleaded, the entitlement of his status warring with the raw grief in his chest. "I have a right. You lost your rights the night you chose a dossier over your wife." She cut him off, her eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying fire. "You are not here because I forgave you. You are not here because I want you to know them. Do not mistake my desperation for an invitation." She took a step closer, forcing him to look her in the eye. "I ran every test, Edward. I searched every registry in the country. I sold everything I had to pay for specialists who told me the same thing. Their genetics are rare. Too rare. They need a perfect match or they die." Edward swallowed hard, the reality of her words settling like lead in his stomach. "So I'm just biology to you?" "You are a harvest," she stated flatly, stripping him of his humanity just as he had once stripped her of her dignity. "The doctors need to harvest your bone marrow. It is a painful, invasive procedure, and given your age and the amount they need for 2 recipients, it could damage you. It might even kill you." She paused, letting the gravity of the risk hang in the sterile air between them. Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, transforming her from a weary ex-wife into a lioness guarding her wounded cubs. "I don't want you here, Edward," she said, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with the sheer effort of restraining her rage. "I despise you for what you did. But I love them more than I hate you. I don't want you, but I need your blood. Are you going to give it, or are you going to walk away again?" Edward looked past her shoulder at the 2 fragile figures in the glass room. He saw the machines breathing for them. He saw the life he had thrown away. "Tell me where to sign," he whispered. Edward took a breath that felt like inhaling shattered glass, then pushed open the heavy door to the ICU suite. The air inside was different, thinner, colder, smelling of saline and impending loss. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors was the only sound, a countdown clock ticking away the seconds of the lives he had missed. Lillian stayed by the door, a silent sentinel, allowing him to walk into the firing line alone. He approached the foot of the bed where the 2 girls lay. Up close, the resemblance was not just striking, it was a physical accusation. Vicky and Michelle shared his sharp jawline, the specific arch of his brow, and the storm-gray eyes that had stared back at him from magazine covers for decades. But where his eyes usually held arrogance, theirs held a terrifying, ancient anger. Michelle, the one on the left, looked too weak to speak, her gaze drifting lazily to him before turning away in exhausted dismissal. But Vicky, sitting slightly upright with tubes snaking from her arm, locked eyes with him. Her stare was a weapon. "Who said you could come in here?" Vicky's voice was raspy, brittle like dry leaves, but venomous. Edward's throat closed up. The man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers was rendered mute by a 16-year-old girl in a hospital gown. He took a tentative step forward, his hands trembling. "I wanted to see you. I'm your father." "No, you're not," Vicky spat, struggling to push herself up. The movement made the IV lines sway dangerously. "Our father is a deadbeat who threw Mom out in the rain. You're just a donor, a spare part." "Vicky, please," Edward whispered, the pain of her words hitting him harder than the financial ruin he had once feared. "I didn't know. If I had known—" "You didn't care to know," she screamed, her voice rising to a frantic pitch that cracked the sterile calm of the room. "You chose your money. You chose your stupid reputation. Look at us. Look at what you did." Her face flushed a dangerous crimson, the exertion too much for her failing body. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor fractured. Beep, 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 beep. A high-pitched alarm began to wail, a red light flashing above her bed. Vicky gasped, clutching her chest, her eyes rolling back as the stress overwhelmed her fragile system. "Vicky!" Lillian shouted, rushing from the doorway, shoving Edward aside with the force of a desperate mother. "Get out, Edward, get out!" Nurses swarmed the room in seconds, a blur of blue scrubs and urgent commands. Edward was pushed back, flattened against the wall, useless and horrified. He watched through the chaos as the doctors worked to stabilize the daughter he had just met. The daughter whose heart was failing because he had broken it the moment he walked in the door. He was a stranger with their face, an intruder in their tragedy, and his presence was literally killing them. Dr. Eris Thorne's office was a shrine to bad news, lined with textbooks on oncology and genetic failure. Edward sat on the edge of the leather chair, still vibrating from the scene in the ICU. The echo of the alarm and Vicky's scream still rang in his ears. Lillian sat in the corner, staring at the floor, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding her shattered world together. "Mr. Lawhon, we don't have time for sugarcoating," Dr. Thorne said, adjusting his glasses. He placed a thick document on the desk between them. "The twins are in the end stages of marrow failure. Their bodies aren't just running on empty. They are actively shutting down." "I'm a match," Edward said, his voice hoarse. Lillian said, "I'm a match. Just take what you need." "It's not that simple," Thorne sighed, tapping the file. "Usually, for a donor of your age, we would harvest stem cells from the blood, a peripheral collection. It's safer, easier. But Vicky and Michelle don't have time for your body to produce cells at that rate. They need bone marrow, direct extraction from the pelvic bone." Edward nodded impatiently. "Fine. Do it." "You're not listening," Thorne cut in sharply. "We need enough for 2 recipients who are practically adults. That is a massive volume of marrow to extract from one person in a single session. We'll be drilling into both hips, multiple sites. The anesthesia will be heavy. The recovery will be brutal." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "There are risks, infection, nerve damage, and given the stress on your system, there is a non-zero chance of cardiac arrest on the table. You could wake up with permanent mobility issues, or you could not wake up at all." Lillian looked up then, her eyes locking onto Edward's. For the first time, the anger was dampened by fear. She hated him, yes, but she wasn't asking him to die. "Edward," she started, her voice faint. "You don't have to." Edward didn't let her finish. He didn't look at the doctor. He didn't ask about the recovery time or the impact on his business empire. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his Mont Blanc pen, the same pen he had used to sign billion-dollar acquisitions, and 16 years ago, his divorce papers, and uncapped it. "Is this the waiver?" Edward asked, pointing to the document. "Yes. But you need to read the liability clause." Edward flipped to the back page and slashed his signature across the line with a force that nearly tore the paper. "I don't care about the liability," Edward said, capping the pen with a decisive click. He stood up, looking smaller without his arrogance, but stronger in his resolve. "Take my hips. Take my legs. Take my heart if it helps them. Just keep them alive." He turned to Lillian, his expression stripped of all pretense. "I broke them, Lillian. I was a fool to believe those photos over you. Let me fix this, even if it's the last thing I do." The hospital room assigned to Edward for the pre-op was quiet, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the ICU. Outside the window, the city skyline glittered, a kingdom of steel and glass that he had spent his entire adult life conquering. Yet, as he sat on the edge of the narrow bed in a flimsy hospital gown, stripped of his tailored armor, Edward realized the terrifying truth. He was a king with no heirs, a conqueror with no legacy. If he died on that table tomorrow, a non-zero chance, the doctor had called it. His billions would dissolve into trusts and charities, managed by lawyers who only cared about their fees. There was no one to mourn him, no one to hold his hand as the anesthesia took him under. The realization was a cold, hollow ache in his gut, sharper than any physical pain he anticipated. He reached for the notepad on the bedside table. His hands, usually steady when signing checks that could buy countries, were trembling. He needed to leave something behind. Not money, not assets. Words. "To Vicky and Michelle," he wrote, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. He stared at the names for a long time. "My daughters. I don't know how to be a father," he continued, the pen moving faster now, driven by a desperate need to outrun his regrets. "I was taught that value is calculated in numbers, in returns, in bottom lines. I thought I was a rich man. But tonight, sitting here, I realize I've been bankrupt for 16 years. He paused, wiping a sudden wetness from his cheek. "I am not writing this to ask for forgiveness. I haven't earned that. I am writing this to tell you the truth I should have seen that night in the rain. Your mother was the best part of me, and you are the best part of her. I threw away a universe to save a bank account. If I don't wake up tomorrow, know this. The pain of the procedure is nothing compared to the pain of missing your lives. I am giving you my bone, Marrow, not as a gift, but as a repayment for a debt I can never fully settle. Live, paint, hate math. Be everything I was too afraid to be. Human. I love you. I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that glass room, and I will love you until the last beat of my heart. Edward." He folded the paper with clumsy care, placing it in an envelope marked simply, "For the twins." He set it on the nightstand, next to his watch, a $100,000 timepiece that suddenly felt heavy and useless. He turned off the light, lying back in the dark, waiting for the dawn that would either kill him or redeem him. The operating room was a blinding expanse of white light and stainless steel. Edward lay face down on the table, the cold air raising goose flesh on his exposed back. He could hear the low murmur of the surgical team, the clatter of instruments, and the rhythmic whoosh hiss of the anesthesia machine that was about to pull him under. "Count backward from 10, Mr. Lawhon," the anesthesiologist said, his voice distant and metallic. 10. Edward closed his eyes. 9. He saw the rain against the penthouse window 16 years ago. 8. He saw Lillian's face, tear-streaked and beautiful. 7. He saw Vicky and Michelle, their eyes burning with his own gray fire. The darkness swallowed him, but the pain found him anyway. It was a deep, violating agony that seemed to exist beneath the layers of sedation. They were drilling into his iliac crest, the thick ridge of his pelvic bone. He felt the vibration in his teeth, a dull, grinding pressure that threatened to shatter his spine. His body jerked involuntarily, fighting the intrusion, but the straps held him fast. In the foggy haze of his subconscious, he wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was a mine, being hollowed out to save the gems trapped inside. More, he thought, his mind latching onto the image of the twins. Take more. Across the hall, in the sterile silence of the transplant unit, a different scene was unfolding. Bags of thick crimson fluid, Edward's life force, were being hung on IV stands next to Vicky and Michelle. The dark red liquid began to drip down the tubes, a slow, steady march toward their veins. Back in the OR, the monitors began to shrill. "BP is dropping, 80/50. Heart rate is erratic," a nurse shouted. Edward's heart, strained by the trauma and the massive volume depletion, stuttered. The darkness around him grew heavy, pressing down like the ocean. It would be so easy to let go, to just drift away into the silence where there was no guilt, no regret, no 16 years of mistakes. No. The image of Vicky's anger flashed in his mind. "You're just a spare part." "Not yet," he screamed silently into the void. "I'm not done." He focused on the drip. He imagined his cells entering their bodies, marching like tiny soldiers to fight the sickness that was killing them. He imagined his blood mixing with theirs, knitting together the bond he had severed. He forced his heart to beat, thump, 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 commanding it to keep pumping, to keep giving until there was nothing left to give. "He's stabilizing." The surgeon exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have enough. Close him up." Edward didn't hear them. He was floating in a red haze, tethered to the world only by the thin, fragile thread of his daughter's lives. He had been emptied out, hollowed to the core, and for the first time in his life, he was completely full. Pain was the first thing to return, a deep, throbbing ache in his hips that radiated down his legs. But it was different now. It wasn't the phantom pain of emptiness, it was the solid, heavy pain of sacrifice. Edward blinked his eyes open, the hospital room swimming into focus. He was weak, weaker than he had ever been. Lifting his head from the pillow felt like bench pressing the world. He was no longer the titan of industry in a bespoke suit. He was a fragile man in a thin cotton gown, bruised and broken. "He's awake," a soft voice said. Edward turned his head slowly. Lillian was sitting in the chair beside his bed. She looked exhausted, but the hard lines of her face had softened. There was no hatred in her eyes anymore, only a quiet, weary respect. "The girls?" Edward croaked, his voice a dry rasp. "They're accepting the graft," Lillian said, a faint smile touching her lips. "Dr. Thorne is optimistic. The infusion is finished and the doctors are optimistic. You saved them, Edward." A sob caught in his throat, hot and sharp. He tried to sit up, but the pain forced him back. Lillian stood and adjusted his pillows, her touch gentle, lacking the cold recoil of their first meeting. Can I see them? He whispered. They're still in isolation, she said, but we can wheel you to the window. It took 2 nurses and Lillian to move him into a wheelchair. Every bump was agony, but Edward didn't make a sound. They rolled him down the hall to the glass wall of the transplant unit. Inside, Vicky and Michelle were sleeping, the color already returning to their cheeks, faint but undeniable. The IV bags were empty. His marrow was now part of them, coursing through their veins, rewriting their future. Lillian placed her hand on his shoulder, a simple, heavy weight that grounded him. Vicky asked about you, she said softly. I read her the letter. Edward looked up at her, tears blurring his vision. I wasted so much time, Lillian. I have billions in the bank, and I missed every birthday, every scraped knee, every moment that mattered. I've been so poor. You're here now, Lillian said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached into the room through the glove port in the glass, beckoning him to do the same. Here, hold her hand. Edward slid his hand into the sterile glove. Inside the isolated environment, he reached out and gently, reverently, wrapped his fingers around Vicky's sleeping hand. It was warm. It was alive. As he sat there in his wheelchair, aching and exhausted, stripped of his empire and his ego, holding the hand of the daughter he had almost killed with his pride. Edward B. Lawn closed his eyes and wept. He had lost 16 years. But in this moment, with his blood running in their veins and his wife's hand on his shoulder, he knew with absolute certainty that he was finally, truly, the richest man alive. Are you holding on to a grudge that is costing you your family? Edward waited 16 years and almost lost his daughters forever because he was too proud to listen. He thought he was punishing his wife, but he was punishing himself. Don't let your pride be the reason you end up alone in a room full of money, but empty of love. I dare you to do this today. Type family in the comments if you believe that family is worth more than money. Share this story if you believe in second chances. You never know who on your timeline needs to see this to pick up the phone and fix a broken relationship before it's too late. Tap the like and subscribe button if you want to claim healing for your children and peace for your home. The clock is always ticking. Don't wait for a tragedy to realize what you have. Hug your loved ones tight tonight. Ignore this video if you think money can buy happiness. But hit share if you know love is the only thing that matters.